When I first drifted through Earth's atmosphere and landed somewhere in the United States, I assumed the greatest threat to your species would be something dramatic. Meteor impacts, supervolcanoes, perhaps even your alarming obsession with cheese in a can. I did not expect the real crisis to be far quieter, far slower, and far more devastating. The everyday cost of simply living. From the moment I stepped into an American grocery store and watched a human argue with herself about whether she could afford coffee beans, I realized something was deeply wrong here. Your economy is not collapsing in a cinematic explosion. It's eroding the way mountains do, grain by grain. And most people don't notice until the ground under them is already gone. And yet the people responsible for shaping this system insist nothing is wrong, or worse, they insist they are helping. That contradiction is where our story begins. Because as I studied America, your wages, your prices, your policies, your political debates, a pattern emerged so clear I had to check twice to make sure my translator wasn't malfunctioning. The people who make the rules are not experiencing the same country as everyone else. They live in an America where tax cuts flow upward, debt doesn't matter, tariffs magically pay for themselves, and housing can be made more affordable by stretching a loan across half a human lifetime. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans face rising prices, stagnant incomes, and a political class that treats basic public needs like optional luxuries. This isn't a series of isolated decisions. It's a system built on shifting the costs of national decline downward while preserving the comfort of those at the top. And the part that shocks me most, even more than your love of leaf blowers, is how normalized all of this has become. You're told to celebrate small relief while ignoring the much larger burden quietly placed on your back. You're encouraged to blame each other rather than the machinery squeezing you. You're expected to adjust your standards of living downward, as if that's patriotism rather than policy failure. So in this video, I want to peel back the layers of distraction and look directly at what's really happening. Why America feels more expensive, more stressful, and more unstable than ever. And how leadership, particularly under Trump, turned a long-growing problem into an accelerating crisis. This isn't a story about one man. It's a story about a country reaching a breaking point. Long before I arrived on your planet, and long before Donald Trump stepped into the White House, the United States had already started weakening the foundations of its own economic engine. What struck me most as I studied your history wasn't a single moment of collapse, but a long chain of decisions that quietly steered the country away from shared prosperity and toward a model where stability was sacrificed for short-term gain. If this were a spacecraft, the engineers would be fired instantly. But in America, the people making these choices were rewarded, re-elected, and celebrated for growing the economy, even as the engine powering that growth shook itself apart. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was deceptively polite. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, political leaders embraced deregulation as a solution to every problem. Industries were freed from oversight, financial markets were unleashed, and corporations were encouraged to prioritize shareholder profits over worker well-being. The old economic covenant, where productivity gains were shared between owners and workers, dissolved. Wages flattened, even as corporate profits soared. Families compensated by taking on more debt, working more hours, and sending more household members into the workforce. This wasn't prosperity. It was pressure disguised as progress. Meanwhile, America's manufacturing base was slowly hollowed out. Globalization wasn't inherently destructive, but the way the US pursued it was uniquely self-sabotaging. Corporations outsourced labor to cut costs. Investors celebrated the rising stock prices, and politicians promised that new knowledge economy jobs would more than replace the old ones. They didn't. Entire regions lost their economic purpose. Towns that once built steel, cars, appliances, and electronics were left with shuttered factories and declining tax bases. As an alien, I was baffled. Why would a nation willingly abandon the industries that anchored its middle class? Humans are usually quite attached to their tools. Layered on top of this was America's increasing dependence on the financial sector. More of your economy became devoted to lending, borrowing, leveraging, speculating, activities that generate wealth without producing much of real value. Inequality deepened. The wealthy gained not just money, but political influence, shaping policy to their advantage. And because campaigns require enormous funding, both major political parties became entangled in the priorities of donors rather than voters. By the time Trump arrived, the system was already tilted heavily toward corporate interests. Then came the culture of short-termism, quarterly profits, election cycles, instant gratification. Leaders stopped planning for long-term national strength. Infrastructure aged, healthcare costs ballooned, education stagnated, and pensions weakened. These weren't sudden crises. They were predictable outcomes of neglect. And voters, overwhelmed by the complexity of the system, were fed simplified narratives that blamed immigrants, trade partners, or political enemies instead of decades of bipartisan economic mismanagement. By the time Trump took office, he didn't create a broken system. He simply exploited one. His policies amplified every existing weakness, rewarding corporations, neglecting workers, ignoring structural problems, and offering quick political sugar highs instead of meaningful solutions. What I observed, analyzing your economy with fresh extraterrestrial eyes, was that America didn't fall. It drifted, gradually, quietly, and with stunning predictability. The engine wasn't sabotaged, it was abandoned. When Trump launched his sweeping corporate tax cut, he sold it as a miracle cure, a bold injection of fuel into America's economic engine. But when I examined the mechanics of this policy, it looked less like an engine tune-up and more like someone siphoning gas out of the tank and calling it maintenance. Trump described the 2017 tax bill as big and beautiful, and in a narrow sense, it certainly was. Corporations received an enormous financial windfall. Wealthy individuals saw their tax burdens fall dramatically, and shareholders celebrated with roaring enthusiasm. But when a nation restructures its tax system this dramatically, the effects don't stay contained in balance sheets. They ripple outward into wages, prices, investment decisions, and public budgets. And those ripples shape the affordability crisis you feel today. One of the clearest promises of the tax cut was that corporations would use their newfound savings to raise worker wages, expand hiring, and invest in long-term growth. That promise evaporated almost immediately. Instead of flowing into paychecks, the majority of corporate tax savings went into stock buybacks, a maneuver that inflates share prices, enriches executives, and delivers little benefit to the workers whose labor actually produces value. This wasn't an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system built around maximizing shareholder returns at all costs. Companies did exactly what they were incentivized to do, while political leaders pretended they were shocked by the result. The tax cut also created a second, less obvious consequence. It made it easier for businesses to absorb future policy shocks. When Trump later imposed tariffs, which function as a hidden tax, corporations had already been compensated. Their tax burden had been lowered so dramatically that the cost of tariffs could be passed on to consumers without significantly damaging profit margins. This is why, despite political rhetoric claiming China was paying for the tariffs, prices for everyday Americans crept upward. Companies didn't suffer. Households did. In effect, the tax cut and the tariffs worked together like two gears in the same machine, shifting more of the financial strain onto ordinary people while insulating corporate America from harm. But perhaps the most overlooked consequence was what the policy did to the government's fiscal capacity. By slashing tax revenue, the federal government became even more dependent on borrowing to fund basic operations. This amplified the national debt and reduced the government's ability to respond to future crises, economic, environmental, or geopolitical. A nation with fewer financial tools becomes more fragile, more anxious, and more willing to reach for cheap political tricks disguised as solutions. And here is where Trump's approach differs from traditional conservative economics. Past Republican leaders justified tax cuts as part of a broader ideological vision. Trump used them as political currency, a preemptive gift to donors, corporations, and loyal power blocs. It was a transaction, not a philosophy. And in that transaction, everyday Americans paid the price. What I observed, watching this unfold, like an alien anthropologist in a land of contradictions, is that the big beautiful tax cut was not designed to rebuild America. It was designed to buy silence from the beneficiaries, while the rest of the population absorbed the fallout. Tariffs are one of those policies that sound bold and muscular when shouted from a political stage. "We're going to make other countries pay" is a simple, satisfying message, the kind of thing that lights up crowds and wins applause. But when I analyze tariffs through the calm, unexcited mind of someone who has studied 14 civilizations that collapsed before yours, I saw something different. A tariff is just a tax, not a mystical foreign-funded penalty. A tax. A tax on imported goods that American companies must pay when those products enter the country. And like every tax on business in every society I've ever studied, the cost doesn't stay with the business. It gets passed on, quietly, inevitably, to consumers. Trump never wanted to call tariffs a tax, because that would ruin the story. The narrative required Americans to believe someone else was paying. China, Mexico, globalists, whoever the villain of the week happened to be. But companies don't operate on myth. They operate on math. When they paid the tariff at the border, they simply raised prices on the shelves. Coffee, appliances, clothing, tools, electronics, all nudged upward. A few cents here, a few dollars there. It felt like inflation, but it was policy-induced inflation, designed not to punish foreign nations, but to extract money from American wallets without saying the word tax. You didn't vote for this tax. You simply experienced it. Now here's where the trick deepens. Those same corporations absorbing these tariffs had just received enormous tax cuts. They were, essentially, prepaid for the inconvenience. Their books were padded, their margins protected, their executives rewarded. So when tariffs kicked in, they didn't panic. They passed the cost to you while keeping their profits intact. In that sense, the tax cut and the tariffs formed a perfect loop. Money flowed upward, pressure flowed downward, and the political performance continued uninterrupted. From my extraterrestrial point of view, what fascinated me most wasn't the economics. It was the psychology. Humans, as clever as you are, can be remarkably vulnerable to linguistic manipulation. Call a tax a tariff, and suddenly millions of people support it, even when it empties their pockets. It's as if your brains have a small software glitch. Labels override logic. On my planet, we patched that bug centuries ago. Highly recommend it. But beyond the humor lies a deeper consequence. These tariffs strained household budgets at a moment when wages were stagnant, debt was rising, and living costs were already suffocating ordinary families. Prices rose faster than paychecks. Frustration grew. People blamed the wrong enemies, and the political class took advantage of the confusion. The tariffs didn't fix the trade deficit. They didn't revive manufacturing. They didn't discipline foreign governments. What they did do was introduce a stealth tax on hundreds of millions of Americans while shielding the wealthy from the impact. That's not strategy. It's sleight of hand. And by the time the public realized they were holding the bill, the policy was already baked into the economy. When I first heard an American president proudly announce a 50-year mortgage, I genuinely thought I misinterpreted the translation. On most planets, extending a loan so far beyond a human working lifespan is considered a sign of systemic failure, not innovation. But once I understood the political logic behind it, everything clicked into place. A 50-year mortgage isn't a solution to housing affordability. It's a confession. It says, without admitting it directly, that homes have become so expensive, wages so insufficient, and economic pressure so overwhelming that the only way people can afford a roof is by stretching debt across generations. It's not a policy designed to help you buy a home. It's a policy designed to help politicians avoid fixing the real problem. For decades, the American housing market has drifted further and further out of reach for young families. As income stagnated and housing shortages grew, policymakers consistently avoided reforms that would build more homes, lower land costs, or reduce speculation. Instead, they tinkered with credit, making it easier and cheaper to borrow. Cheap borrowing creates the illusion of affordability, even as it pushes prices higher. It's like lowering the gravity on a dying planet. Sure, you can walk easily, but the atmosphere is still evaporating. A 50-year mortgage is simply the extreme end of that credit-based illusion. The arithmetic is brutally simple. When a loan stretches from 30 to 50 years, monthly payments drop slightly, but the total interest paid skyrockets. Over a lifetime, the borrower ends up paying far more for the same home. The bank earns more, the lender earns more, the financial system earns more, and the buyer stays in debt for nearly their entire adult life. On my planet, we refer to this arrangement as soft servitude. Humans call it home ownership. What makes this policy especially alarming is the political timing. Instead of addressing shortages, rising construction costs, or barriers to development, the government chose to extend debt. Instead of raising wages or rebalancing economic power, it stretched the burden across 2 generations. Instead of confronting reality, it disguised it. That is not economic strategy. That is economic panic. What I found most revealing, studying this policy as an alien anthropologist, is how openly it exposes the priorities of your leadership. They would rather keep the housing market inflated, protecting banks, investors, and real estate interests, than allow prices to fall to levels ordinary Americans can afford. They would rather ask young adults to chain themselves to half-century debt than confront the structural causes of this crisis. They would rather pretend that a 50-year mortgage is an opportunity instead of admitting it's a symptom of national decline. And perhaps the cruelest part is this. The burden of these extended mortgages doesn't fall on the wealthy or the politically connected. It falls on those who are simply trying to build a life. The people who work hard, follow the rules, and still find the prize drifting further away. A society reveals its values through the lives it makes possible, and the lives it makes impossible. By that measure, America's housing crisis speaks volumes. One of the first things I noticed while studying human civilizations is that empires don't fall the way movies portray them. There's no dramatic explosion, no thunderous collapse, no sudden cliff drop into chaos. Decline is quiet, almost polite at first. It shows up in smaller paychecks, higher prices, slower repairs, shrinking services, and rising frustration. But the most predictable feature of decline, across every society I've studied, including a few that make Rome look like a weekend project, is that the people at the top never feel the fall the same way as everyone else. They insulate themselves with wealth, power, and political influence. And as the system weakens, they tighten their grip, ensuring the pain flows downward, never upward. America, for all its uniqueness, is not an exception. Consider the trajectory of economic inequality in the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, the gap between a corporate executive and an average worker was large but not grotesque, roughly 30 or 35 to 1. Not healthy, perhaps, but manageable. Today, that gap has ballooned to around 300 to 1. This isn't the result of talent suddenly increasing by a factor of 10. It's the result of a system that allows those with power to rewrite the rules in their favor. While workers are told to tighten their belts, executives enjoy compensation packages so extravagant they would be considered comedic exaggerations on many other planets. This isn't just about money. It's about who absorbs the shocks. When prices rise because of tariffs, supply chain issues, or corporate markups, everyday families feel it immediately. When housing becomes unaffordable, they're the ones pushed into decades of debt or forced out of their communities. When the national debt spirals, public programs are the first targets for cuts, not corporate subsidies or military budgets. The powerful are shielded from consequences, just as they have been in every declining empire across human history. What makes the American version particularly insidious is how effectively the elite have convinced ordinary people to blame themselves or their neighbors. Instead of questioning the policies that funnel wealth upward, people are encouraged to fight over scraps. Immigrants, cultural grievances, lifestyle choices, anything that distracts from the real structure of power. It's a brilliant strategy. Keep the public divided, keep them busy, keep them exhausted. Divided citizens challenge each other. United citizens challenge the system. And here's the moment where my alien perspective finds tragic irony. On my homeworld, every major decline was preceded by the same pattern. Wealth concentrating at the top, public institutions weakening, leadership focusing on symbolic gestures instead of structural fixes, and citizens increasingly feeling that the system was rigged against them. The elites always assumed they could ride out the decline without consequence, until the decline consumed the very foundations they depended on. America hasn't reached that point yet. But the warning signs are unmistakable. When an empire ages, the people at the top cling tighter to their privileges, and the people below are expected to simply absorb the cost. The question is how long they will continue doing so. For decades, the United States operated under a comforting assumption. No matter how risky its decisions, how large its deficits, or how chaotic its politics, the world would always bend to accommodate it. That assumption wasn't arrogance. It was historical reality. After World War II, America was so dominant that it could shape global trade, finance, and diplomacy to its liking. If it needed to borrow trillions, the world lent it. If it imposed sanctions, most nations complied. If it launched tariffs or military threats, others recalculated rather than retaliated. But when I arrived and began observing the current geopolitical landscape, it was clear that this era of American economic immunity is ending. The world is shifting, and for the first time in generations, the US must adapt rather than dictate. China and Russia, often portrayed as singular threats in American discourse, have formed something far more consequential. An economic and strategic partnership built on long-term planning, resource coordination, and shared resistance to US influence. China's manufacturing power paired with Russia's energy and commodity reserves creates a combined force that the United States can no longer easily pressure or isolate. This doesn't mean America is weak. It means it finally has a rival big enough to ignore its demands. On my planet, we call this moment the equalizing. When a dominant power first encounters a competitor, it cannot simply outmuscle. This shift becomes even more significant when viewed through the lens of sanctions and military strategy. For decades, the US used sanctions as a low-risk tool to punish adversaries, confident that other nations would uphold them. But in recent years, sanctioned countries have developed workarounds, alternative payment systems, new trade routes, and deeper alliances with one another. When a tool stops working, but a nation continues using it out of habit, it signals that the tool was never a strategy, just a crutch. At the same time, America's military influence is strained. Deploying naval power near Venezuela or maintaining global bases may create symbolic pressure, but geopolitical gestures cannot compensate for structural economic weaknesses. A superpower can't sustain dominance on drama alone. And when Russia publicly announces it will oppose US intervention in the Western Hemisphere, a region long treated as untouchable under the Monroe Doctrine, it signals a seismic shift. The world is less intimidated than before. Yet the most consequential change is financial. China and Russia, along with other emerging economies, now hold increasing leverage over global commodity flows, manufacturing chains, and diplomatic blocs. As America's national debt balloons into unprecedented territory, its ability to unilaterally control international markets diminishes. The irony, which I admit made one of my antennae twitch, is that the US helped create the very global system that now constrains it. For the ordinary American, this shift doesn't feel like geopolitics. It feels like higher prices, more instability, and fewer buffers against global shocks. The safety nets that once protected America from its own policy mistakes are thinning. The rest of the world is no longer absorbing the consequences for you. And whether Americans realize it or not, that marks a turning point. The United States didn't wake up one morning buried under trillions of dollars in debt. It arrived here step by step, year by year, as leaders discovered they could avoid difficult choices by borrowing instead of governing. What shocked me most as an outsider wasn't the size of the debt itself, but how casually America accumulated it, as if the bill would never come due. as if the world would forever finance its indecision. Decades of tax cuts for the wealthy, endless wars, and bipartisan reluctance to raise revenue created a structural gap between what the government spends and what it collects. That gap widened until borrowing became the default, not the exception. The result is a fiscal landscape where interest payments now compete with essential public programs. Money that could fund healthcare, infrastructure, or education is instead consumed by servicing past decisions. And because raising taxes on corporations or the rich remains politically untouchable, the burden shifts downward. Services shrink. Safety nets weaken. Communities are told to do more with less, even as the wealthiest Americans flourish. What makes this debt crisis especially dangerous right now is that it intersects with rising global instability. As other nations grow less willing to bankroll US deficits, borrowing becomes riskier and more expensive. A country that once dictated global finance now finds itself constrained by it. The tragedy is that ordinary Americans are paying for a problem they didn't create, watching their futures narrowed by leaders who postponed responsibility for decades, until responsibility finally caught up. What puzzled me most, studying American politics with fresh extraterrestrial eyes, wasn't the complexity of the economic problems. It was how effectively the public is convinced to support policies that work against their own well-being. Part of this comes from deliberate political storytelling. Leaders frame tax cuts as growth, tariffs as strength, and rising prices as unfortunate side effects, never admitting these choices funnel wealth upward. Another part comes from media ecosystems that reward outrage over clarity, leaving many people informed by emotion rather than economics. And then there is the human vulnerability to branding. Call a tax a tariff, call debt a mortgage extension, call corporate giveaways incentives, and suddenly harmful policies feel patriotic. But beneath all of that is exhaustion. Most Americans are working harder than ever, earning less than they need, and drowning in contradictory information. When your daily life feels like a battle, you don't have time to decode policy sleight of hand. You trust whatever message feels familiar, comforting, or aligned with your frustrations. A clever politician doesn't need to solve your problems. They only need to explain them in a way that directs your anger away from the real causes. And in that gap between perception and reality, inequality quietly expands. Despite everything America is facing, rising inequality, political manipulation, unaffordable living costs, and weakening global leverage, decline is not destiny. Every civilization I've studied reached a crossroads where its people could either accept the slow slide downward or demand a restructuring of the systems draining their future. The United States is standing at that very crossroads now. The problems are enormous, but they're not mysterious. They can be confronted directly. Rebalancing the tax system, rebuilding public institutions, restraining corporate power, investing in real wages, and refusing to let political theater overshadow material reality. The real choice belongs not to the elites who benefit from the current system, but to the millions who carry its weight. Ordinary Americans hold far more collective power than they realize, but only if they stop fighting each other and start challenging the structures that shape their lives. And while I may be just a curious alien observing your society with equal parts fascination and concern, even I can see the path forward. Clarity, solidarity, and a refusal to accept policies that ask you to sacrifice while others profit. America's future isn't predetermined. It's negotiable. And the negotiation starts when people decide they've had enough.